Hello everyone, it's Leanna, the pastry queen. So I was asked to do a formal video on the Quilt of Valor and some ideas that one can use. So yes, I have a smock on today. So some of you have seen this quilt. Let me span the quilt for you. There it is. This is a 60 by 80 quilt, okay? And what I did is I used scraps. So in the center here is a block and I bordered it. All my blocks are actually bordered different dimensions because depending on this little scrap I had is how I came up to it. All I could tell you is that the finished block is 9.5 inches. I made sure I trimmed everything down to 9.5 inches. See how this one's a little different than this one? I just went with the scraps I had and just added a border, a solid border, whether it be a red border or a blue border. Again, sometimes I use 2.5 inch strips around, sometimes I use 3.5. In the end, I used a 9.5 inch ruler. Shouldn't say 9.5 inch square ruler. Here it is. 9.5 inch square ruler to square off all my blocks. Okay, that was the first thing I did. This center could be anything. It could be a crumb piece. It could be a solid block. It could be whatever it is you want it to be, as long as by the time you're done bordering it, it is 9.5 inches. Here I used 4 charms or 4 5-inch squares. Scraps, strips, whatever you have. I happen to use strips. I made strip sets. I made, I put 2 fabrics together with the fabric. I sewed it all the way down, and then I cut them into 5-inch pieces. But you can just take 4 charms or 4 5-inch squares, sew them together to make a 4 patch. So this whole quilt comprises of scraps. I bordered the scraps and 5-inch squares or 5-inch of width of fabric. When I did that, all I did was alternate it. And then I added here, I don't remember, but I'm going to measure this. This was a 3.5 inch strip. So after I did this all, it's a 3.5 inch strip. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 down. So 6 across, 8 down. They're 9.5 inch blocks with a 3.5 inch border. That is how I created this Quilt of Valor. So I'm going to go now to the next Quilt of Valor. Okay. The next Quilt of Valor. The next Quilt of Valor. If you look at my thumbnail to this video, you are going to see this backing. It's going to look like this with only this on its sides. And it was a backing I made for a quilt. And then I decided not to use it, so it had been sitting in my stash. I said, well, it's red, white, and blue. Let's make it into a Quilt of Valor. So what I did here was I went ahead and I did do a video on it, and then the video camera never took it. So I'm going to explain. This whole thing was a backing with this on its sides, okay? What I did was I cut in here 24 inches. So this here measured 24 inches, and then I cut the sides, which left me 2 huge, another about 12.5 inch plus piece. I cut that into 6.5 inch pieces. I know this is a little confusing. So if you look at my thumbnail, you're going to see this all blue. I cut this off and I cut this off. I added this white 6.5 inch strip. I cut this into 2, right? So I had that and I put that in there, 6.5 inch. And then I have another piece of fabric that was gifted to me that I did 6.5 inch. So this is a vertical quilt, okay? So when I sewed this was already sewn. I sewed this going down, but then I sewed this going up and then this going down to keep things square. What I did to the right side, I also did to the left side. So again, when I cut this, I just cut this panel, left this together, added 6.5 inch of this white. I added this back to here that I cut off of here, and then I added this extra fabric. When I cut all this left me with 2 more of these strips that you see here, not from here. 2 more of these strips here. And I needed length. So what I did was I went ahead and put one of them strips on the top and one of them on the bottom. And this really went by so quick. Now, let's say you don't have a backing. I started this with a backing and I just chop-a-lopped it up and just kind of made it up. We can do this. We can do this without even having the backing and chopping that up. We can go ahead, and these are just scraps from a fat quarter. I just took my scraps and they are 8.5 inches. So this is an 8.5 inch piece by a 10.5 inch piece, okay? Again, this is an 8.5 inch piece, and this one happens to be an 11.5 inch piece. But what I did basically was I took a bunch of scraps in the center, and I created 8.5 inches wide, okay? If you're going to do this on your own, you're going to find scraps, and you're just going to make sure it's 8.5 inches wide. And then coming off of this is another 8.5 inches here, 8.5 inches here. Then here I had 6.5 inch, 6.5 inch, and another 6.5 inch. Again, on the other side as well. So again, these middle 3 are 8.5, and these outer 3s are 6.5. Now you're wondering, well, how long are they, Leanna? How long are they? Well, we'll go measure it, because if we're going to do this from the beginning, which is what I asked. Someone asked me to do this. How can they recreate this on their own if they don't have the backing piece like I had? I know I have to add a 1/2 inch there. So I'm going down. Oops. Let's try that again. And I am kind of doing this live. I'm not going to edit. So this is 71 inches in length. So 71 inches in length. So you would need an 8.5 by 71, an 8.5 by 71, an 8.5 by 71, and then an 8.5 by 6.5, 8.5. Did I say 8.5? No. 8.5 by 71, 8.5 by 71, 8.5 by 71, 6.5 by 71, 6.5 by 71, 6.5 by 71, and the same thing, the other 3 are 6.5 by 71. Now our top. Our top is this 6.5 inch piece, but it is roughly around 60.5 inches. So 6.5 by 60.5 inches. What I honestly would do is do this and measure this and then do the top and bottom, because we all sew differently, right? We all have different ways of sewing on our long arm. So with that said, here is 2 Quilts of Valor quilts that I whipped up pretty quickly using scraps and stuff that I had laying around. And with that said, I'm going to open up 2 things.